Husbye, and
no, it's up.
Okay.
You're good. I'm fine.
He's a fourth-year doctoral candidate in the Department of Literacy, Culture, and Language Education. And prior to IU, he was a first-grade teacher in southeast Michigan. So his research interests include gender and education, technology integration, and also teacher identity.
I wrote a much more entertaining introduction, but she chose not to go with that one. Probably for good reasons. So my presentation today is entitled Penguins and Moral Panic, the Construction of Us and Them in Computer-Mediated Communication. And to introduce, not go straight to the sample, to introduce, this project kind of started in a story. In my first grade classroom, I read the book And Tango Makes Three with my first graders, and they were so into it.
What was it again?
And Tango Makes Three.
I don't know if everyone knows that.
Yeah, I'm going to get back to it in a moment.
Okay.
So that's just a side piece for the moment. I read this book with my first graders, and they were so into it, and we had really great discussion. But I found that after 3:30 dismissal, I sat in front of my phone with just this huge sense of dread. And I stared at my phone and my computer monitor, and I just kept going back and forth, because I just was having this physiological reaction to bringing this book, which I will talk about, the baggage that this book brings in just a moment, to my kids. And I've been teasing out these stories that I've worked through my doctoral work, these stories that happened in my classroom, and really unpacking them and thinking about them. And so this is the story that this project's kind of rooted in. Why was this moment, and the phone never rang, I never got an email, but why was I filled with such dread at this moment about reading a book about lesbian and gay issues to my first graders? What was happening there to me as a teacher? So to get into some more of the theoretical spaces, there's been a huge push recently in academia for LGBT inclusive materials at the early elementary level. You know, especially in the last 2 months where we've seen a rash of suicides by lesbian and gay youth. For instance, Tyler Clementi at Rutgers, Billy Lucas, who was here in Indiana, and Corey Jackson, who was up in Michigan. Just 3 of the 18 LGBT-linked suicides this month. Okay, so there's been a huge push for kind of LGBT inclusion, and within these articles, there's always this like little side note. Oh, there might be opposition, but they never go into what that opposition is. So keep that in mind. What is that opposition? There's also, as I'm reading through computer-mediated communication materials, it seems like computer-mediated communication is somewhat has this homophobic bent, where it is more acceptable within these digital spaces to engage in discourse that is disparaging of lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgendered individuals. So also keep that in mind as I'm going through all of this. And then also keep in mind that computer-mediated communication is communication that happens in digital space. For this case, I'm looking at Amazon.com. In order to make the connection between what is happening on Amazon.com and what is happening in my classroom, I had to turn to marketing materials, where there's quite a few people. Maislin, who is, I believe, at Penn, she's at Wharton now, has done a lot of work with book reviews on online book sites. And what she's managed to do is create this correlation between these online book discussions and actual live word of mouth, and found them to be equitable, that the same patterns of communication happen when we talk about books amongst friends and when we talk about books online. Specifically with Amazon. Barnes & Noble, not so much. So keep those things in mind as we're going through. For a sample, I looked at And Tango Makes Three, which, for those of you who are not familiar, it's a picture book by Parnell and Richardson. It came out in 2004. It's a true story about 2 male penguins at the Central Park Zoo who raise a chick. together. So it's a book filled with soft watercolors and charming words, and has been on the American Library Association's most banned book list since its release. So it's the #1 most banned book in all of America for the past 5 years strong. If you do a Google search for it, you will find news reports, you will find many, many blogs who just don't like it. So that's the context. It is the most contested book for the past 5 years, this 32-page picture book. So what I've done is I've taken customer reviews posted to Amazon.com's page for this book, and I've used computer-mediated discourse analysis, which comes from Susan Herring over in the School of Library and Information Science, to more fully understand the contestation of LGBT issues in the early elementary classroom. What I wanted to do was kind of pull apart that feeling of dread I had after reading that book with my first graders, and pull apart what I was expecting to hear if my phone rang, and if I had an email pop up or pop into my inbox. So just trying to gauge what would be said to me if something happened like that. So moving on to research questions and hypotheses. As I was thinking about that reaction in that moment, I realized I was reacting to a binary, an us and a them. There was a me, and there was everyone else kind of in that space. So for my research questions, I was looking at who are the us and them groups surrounding the discourse around this book. And then once I have an understanding of who these us and them groups are, what are the ideological squares, and this is an idea coming from Van Dyke, that are used to reify these positions. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about what that ideological square is in a moment. And then I also wanted to know, what do the roles of invectives or flaming play in the establishment of these ideological squares? And flaming is a discursive pattern of sarcasm or putting down, or it's kind of the computer-mediated version of yelling or being snarky, might be another way to think of it. I had a hypothesis as I was working through all of this data that there will be few, if any, individuals who do not adhere to any group. There's going to be an us and there's going to be a them, and there's not going to be really anyone in between. So that was my hypothesis as I worked through this group of data. So a little bit about my research methodology. I used critical computer-mediated discourse analysis, drawing once again from Herring and Van Dyke, who talk about taking this computer-mediated discourse, which manifests itself in very interesting ways from verbal talk. It's already transcribed one, that's a beautiful thing. But along with that already being transcribed, there are certain things that we need to pay attention to in terms of who responds to what. That's not always clear, tone, etc. that don't always come across. So I followed Herring's methodologies for dealing with those things. And then Van Dyke was the critical piece coming in and reading meaning into those words that were given to me by the Amazon.com website. Analysis happened on 2 different levels. First, I looked at the ideological stances that were present within the reviews, and for that I paid attention to 106 customer reviews from the publication of the book in 2004 through December of 2009. So there were 106 customer reviews to look through. After I had identified ideological stances, I looked at ideological squares, and for that I added to the 106 customer reviews 197 comments to customer reviews. If you've ever been on Amazon.com, you can post a review about a book to the book's website, but then you can also thread comments to those reviews. Okay, so you have these conversations going on a very macro level and a very micro level, where people are responding to others' reviews, and then you have these micro conversations within the comments that are responding to the reviews as well. So, in terms of ideological stance, I defined ideology as such. It's a self-serving schema for the representation of us and them as social groups, and reflects the fundamental social